Hello. With this presentation, we start a series on nonviolence and civil resistance among Palestinians, a series that will take us from the 1980s until to the Second Intifada, and we will discuss in which way violence and non-violence alternated themselves among Palestinians throughout several crucial points, among them the first Intifada and then the second. To start with, I think we should mention and have a look at the life and works of Mubarak Awad, who was a Jerusalemite. He was born in 1943. This is his picture, who is now residing and living in the US, as we will see at the end of this presentation. In the 1970s, Awad was in the US, where he studied, in fact. He took his BA and then MA and then PhD. And at the time, he familiarized himself with the works of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. And it's only in the 1980s, at the beginning of the 1980s, that he returned to Jerusalem to train other psychologists and social workers to treat Palestinian youth. He obtained his PhD. He had obtained his PhD in '77 in clinical psychology. Among the many works on the First Intifada, I should mention here the work that I've already mentioned in our introduction, a study by Mary Elizabeth King entitled A Quiet Revolution, the First Palestinian Intifada and Nonviolent Resistance, which is a very comprehensive study of non-violence during the First Intifada and among Palestinians. So much of the material that you will find in this and in the following slides actually comes from there. As Mary Elizabeth King quotes a number of writings by Awad, and this is a quote which I think is relevant and very important, that states, "Under occupation, there is so much frustration, so much anger, so much enmity that the children don't know how to handle it. When they try to do something about it, they are likely to handle it with violence." So, in a way, Awad saw violence as a pathological condition of Palestinian life because of the conditions in which they were living, i.e. under occupation. And that was a situation that he saw as developing a really deep hatred, and I quote, "so deep that Palestinians are not functioning normally as individuals or as groups or in groups." So in 1983, in the same year that he goes back to Jerusalem, Awad set up a Palestinian counseling center, conducted a number of workshops for teachers and social workers at the YMCA in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, and finally joined forces with his cousin, a lawyer, Jonathan Kutab, and together they authored a series of papers in which they argued the necessity of non-violence resistance by Palestinians. And this is the first one that you see listed, Non-Violence in the Occupied Territories, published in 1983, is in fact the booklet that appeared originally under the name only of Mubarak Awad. So here we have an articulation of what it means to be non-violent and what are the advantages of non-violence over violence for the in general and for the specific situation of the occupied territories of Palestinians under occupation. So first of all, institution building institutions in a society because that strengthens its capacity to resist. Institution in this context, point number 2, means civilian structures that are controlled from the bottom by the people. Now, there are consequences to maintain these institutions. Two of them are in fact that to maintain these institutions, one may have to defy orders or operate underground in committees. And so, in a way, this meant to understand, to study and understand how power is structured and how complicated is the exercise of power, especially in an asymmetrical conflict as the one that we are dealing with. In this booklet, there's an articulation of how each individual personally should assume responsibility for ending the occupation, but also the responsibility, developing a sense of responsibility whereby everyone, every individual, should also accept the consequences for exercising nonviolent protest and stand for the principle. Appended to this booklet was a list of 121 methods of nonviolent protests, which were reduced from the originally 198 methods elaborated or published by Gene Sharp in his famous book, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, which really was a very inspirational work for Awad and Kutab and others, as we shall see. According to Mary Elizabeth King, the book A Quiet Revolution that I mentioned earlier, this book was circulated underground in a way, but not really that underground, in the sense that copies could be found often around the territories between 1983 and 1984. King quotes the example of a booklet left on a bus and picked up and left in a cafe where someone else would get it and then leave it in a clinical, in a clinic, and so on, so that it's really difficult to evaluate which kind of circulation these between 4,000 and 7,000 copies booklets, which kind of circulation it had and how many people read it. But apparently, according to the estimate of King in her book, apparently it was very widely circulated. So there is clearly a question mark as to where did the authors and the booklet stand in the question, not only standing between non-violence and violence, as the choice is very clearly for the former, for non-violence, but what is the standing of these two organizers, if you want, vis-à-vis the PLO. Remember that the PLO is now has just been removed from Lebanon and is now in Tunis, is settling in Tunis, and the leadership of the of Palestinians, the officially recognized leadership of the Palestinians, is now further away from the occupied territories. So, in a way, the position of Awad and eventually Kutab is that of not condemning openly the PLO, and also vis-à-vis the question of violence, non-violence, is not really non-violence seems more of a choice of a tactical choice, in the sense that Awad and Kutab do not entirely reject the possibility of violence, even though they're convinced that violence would only make Palestinians weaker in general, in the situation in which they are, and vis-à-vis clearly the IDF, the Israeli army. So there is a very strong choice for non-violence, but also a concession that violence could be exercised. On the Journal of Palestine Studies in 1984, Awad published a sort of a compendium of his booklet in English, and the article is entitled "Nonviolent Resistance: A Strategy for the Occupied Territories." And here we have an important point that Awad makes, that is that given the situation in the occupied territories at the time of writing, that is in the mid-80s, there are a number of limiting factors in the nature and in the possibilities of the Palestinian struggle, whereby non-violence is and remains the preferred choice. So he listed 9 points, which I'm going to, which we can read together. First of all, is that there are 1.3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, which are untrained militarily and who are not permitted to possess weapons, either as individuals or in groups, which clearly limits the potential of violence as a strategy. Moreover, point number 2, they do not have the necessary lines of communications to receive military supplies, to be able to carry on continuous military operations against the occupiers for a protected amount of time. Point number 3, the control of the military government over all aspects of the lives of Palestinian people is very extensive. Palestinians depend economically on Israel. There are collaborators. And outside the occupied territories, there is a lack of accepted and recognized leadership. Point number 7, the process of colonization of the West Bank Gaza Strip through settlement construction happens through the use, confiscation and limitation of resources of Palestinians, especially land and water, and through a process of limitation of the institutions and rights of Palestinians. The settlements, point number 8, continue to expand, and it appears clear in 1984, at least to Awad, that there is no hope that someone from the outside, whether it's it's Arab governments or the military branches of the PLO, will come to the rescue of Palestinians. So in these conditions, Awad argues, non-violence is the only possible means for organizing a successful resistance. In 1988, that is 1 year into, actually less than that, 6 months into the first Intifada, Mubarak Awad was deported from Israel on a visa technicality, and he is now, in fact, in the United States. But please follow me to the next set of slides, where we will see some of his work in the mid-1980s and how he somehow helped lay the ground or the basis for the growth of popular committees, or he contributed in a way to the development of popular committees, which then became a stronghold of the first Intifada. Thank you.